The station alarm didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a funeral bell. 3 short blasts, then silence, then 3 more. Everyone on Frontier Station 9 knew what that pattern meant. Someone important was missing. Not a lost tool. Not a misplaced supply crate. Someone. Lieutenant Carol Briggs was the first human to hear it. She was halfway through her second cup of coffee, terrible coffee, the kind that tasted like burnt plastic mixed with regret, when the alarm cut through the quiet hum of the station's ventilation system. She set the cup down slowly, looked at the ceiling like it owed her an explanation. Then her radio crackled. Briggs, get to the Valkyrie wing. Now. She didn't ask questions. You didn't ask questions when the voice on the other end sounded like that. By the time Carol reached the eastern corridor, the whole place had already turned into a storm. Valkyrie guards, tall, gray-skinned, with those unsettling silver eyes that never seemed to blink, were moving in every direction at once. Their armor clicked and shifted as they walked, a sound like 100 keys jangling together. They were shouting in their own language, which to human ears sounded somewhere between whale song and static. Whatever they were saying, none of it sounded calm. Carol pressed herself against the wall to avoid getting knocked over by a guard twice her size. Okay, she muttered to herself. Great morning. Commander Lisa Wade was already at the center of it all. Lisa was the kind of person who looked like she'd been built for exactly this kind of situation. Calm face, sharp eyes, short brown hair pulled back so tight it probably gave her a headache. She had spent 4 years on Frontier Station 9 as the human liaison, basically the person whose job it was to stop humans and aliens from accidentally starting a war with each other on a Tuesday. It was a harder job than it sounded. Right now, she was standing in front of Queen Ethon's chief advisor, a Valkyrie elder named Suveth, who was approximately 7 feet tall and currently vibrating with what Lisa had learned to recognize as barely contained fury. The sound coming off him was low and constant like a broken engine. They were here, Suveth said in careful, clipped English. In this wing. Under your station's protection. And now they are not. I understand, Lisa said. Her voice was level. Steady. The kind of steady that takes years to build. We are going to find them. You will find them, Suveth corrected. The difference in those 2 sentences was not lost on anyone in the room. The 3 missing girls were not just any Valkyrie. They were Queen Ethon's daughters. The youngest was barely old enough to walk on her own. The oldest was maybe the equivalent of a human 12-year-old, curious, restless, and according to every report, absolutely terrible at doing what she was told. Their names were difficult for human tongues, so the station staff had quietly started calling them by colors. Red for the eldest, who wore a deep crimson band around her wrist, blue for the middle one, and Dot, because the youngest had a single dark marking on her forehead that looked exactly like someone had pressed a finger there. They had been brought to the station as part of a diplomatic visit. The first of its kind. Queen Ethon had agreed to bring her daughters as a gesture of trust, showing that she believed the station and the humans running it were safe. That was a big deal. The Valkyrie didn't do trust easily. Their entire history was built on the idea that the universe was something to be survived, not enjoyed. Extending trust to another species was, for them, about as vulnerable as you could get. And now the daughters were gone. Lisa stepped away from Suveth and pulled Carol aside. Tell me everything's on the cameras. Working on it, Carol said, already pulling up her tablet. But the Eastern Wing cameras had a maintenance gap. 40 minutes, starting at 0300. Lisa closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Of course they did. Jake was supposed to fix them yesterday. Jake fixes everything eventually, Lisa said. Yesterday and eventually are not the same word. Carol almost smiled. Almost. The last confirmed sighting is here. She pointed at the tablet screen. A corridor junction just outside the Valkyrie guest quarters. The timestamp read 0248. 3 small figures moving together, heading left instead of right. Away from their rooms. Toward the inner station. They went deeper in, Lisa said. Looks like it. On their own. No one with them. Lisa stared at the image for a moment. 3 small shapes on a gray corridor floor, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that meant they knew exactly what they were doing even if nobody else did. Red was in front. Of course she was. They weren't taken, Lisa said. Doesn't look like it. They left on their own. Looks that way. Lisa looked back at Suveth, who was watching her from across the room with those silver eyes that never blinked. Behind him, through the open door of the guest quarters, she could see Queen Ethon herself, tall, still, wrapped in dark fabric, her face unreadable. But her hands were pressed flat against her sides, fingers spread wide. Carol had read enough of the Valkyrie body language briefings to know what that meant. The Queen was terrified. Not angry. Not threatening. Terrified. Like any mother who had looked up and realized her children were gone and the world was suddenly enormous and full of edges. Lisa turned back to Carol. Get me every camera feed from 0248 onward. Every corridor, every room, every storage bay. We find them before this gets any worse. And if it already is worse? Lisa picked up her radio. Then we find them faster. Carol pulled every camera feed she could find and sent them straight to Lisa's tablet. Lisa sat down at the small desk in the monitoring room, rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Outside the door she could still hear the Valkyrie guards moving through the corridors, that constant clicking of armor, that low hum of anxiety that seemed to radiate off all of them. She blocked it out. She had one job right now and it wasn't managing feelings. It was following a trail. She started at 0248. The junction outside the guest quarters. 3 small figures moving left. She switched to the next camera. Picked them up again 30 seconds later. They were moving fast for their size, especially Red, who was practically pulling the other 2 along behind her. Even on a grainy black and white feed, you could tell she was the one with the plan. Whatever that plan was. Lisa followed them camera by camera. It was slow work. Not every corridor had a working camera. Jake Miller had a long list of things to fix and not enough hours in the day, so sometimes she had to guess which way they went and check 2 or 3 feeds before she picked up the trail again. But she kept at it. 1 corridor at a time. They passed the supply storage bay. Didn't stop. They paused outside the engineering workshop for about 40 seconds. Lisa leaned closer to the screen. Red pressed her face against the small window in the door, looked inside, then shook her head at the other 2. They moved on. They found the mess hall. Lisa watched as all 3 of them pushed open the mess hall door and walked in like they owned the place. She almost laughed. The mess hall at 0300 was completely empty, lit by those low overnight lights that made everything look slightly orange. But to 3 small alien kids wandering a human space station in the middle of the night, it was probably the most interesting room they'd ever walked into. They spent 11 minutes in there. Lisa watched them move around the tables, touch everything, open a cabinet and stare at the contents like it was a museum exhibit. The youngest, found someone's forgotten cereal box on the counter and shook it next to her ear for a solid minute, completely fascinated by the sound. Blue discovered the coffee machine and pressed every button on it until it made a horrible gurgling noise, at which point all 3 of them jumped back and then immediately moved closer to investigate. Lisa watched this and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. They weren't scared. They weren't in trouble. They were just kids being kids in a place they weren't supposed to be. They left the mess hall and kept moving. The observation deck was next. Lisa switched feeds and found them standing at the wide curved window, all 3 of them pressed against the glass, looking out at the stars. She couldn't see their faces from this angle, but none of them moved for almost 4 minutes. Just stood there, looking out. Lisa stared at that image for a second longer than she needed to. Then she moved on. From the observation deck they went deeper into the residential block. This was where the trail got easier to follow. The residential corridors were narrower, fewer turns, and the cameras here actually worked because Jake lived in this section and had fixed them himself months ago. She tracked them down the main corridor. Past room 2. Past room 7. Past the small shared bathroom that everyone on this floor had been complaining about for 6 months. They stopped at room 14B. Lisa stared at the feed. Watched Red try the door handle. It opened, because of course it did, because Jake Miller had never once locked his door in 4 years on this station, a fact that had annoyed the security team on at least 3 separate occasions. Red looked back at the other 2. Some kind of silent agreement passed between them. Then all 3 walked in. The timestamp read 0341. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Room 14B. Jake Miller. She pulled up his file out of habit, even though she already knew everything in it. Jake Miller, 31 years old, senior maintenance engineer, originally from a small town in Ohio. 6'2". Broad enough that he had to turn sideways through certain doorways. Quiet. Reliable. Never caused trouble. Never started drama. Showed up on time, fixed what needed fixing and went back to his room. Also, and this was documented somehow in 3 separate incident reports, the man slept like he had been switched off at the wall. Lisa grabbed her radio. Carol. I found them. Lisa stood outside room 14B for a moment before she touched the handle. She had told Carol to hold the guards back. Carol had looked at her like she was slightly insane, but she'd done it. Because Lisa had a feeling, one of those quiet instincts built from 4 years of managing the space between two very different kinds of people, that whatever was on the other side of this door needed to be handled carefully. Not with boots and armor and silver eyes that never blinked. Just her. She pressed the handle down slowly and pushed the door open an inch. Then stopped. The room was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. Jake always ran his heating higher than the rest of the station, something the energy management team brought up every single quarter and Jake nodded at and then completely ignored. Right now, Lisa was grateful for it. The warmth hit her face like stepping into a kitchen where something good had been cooking for hours. She pushed the door open a little more. Jake was on his bunk, flat on his back, one arm hanging off the side, snoring at a volume that was honestly impressive. The man sounded like a truck engine idling. Steady, deep, rhythmic. You could set a clock to it. And tucked against him like they had always been there were all three of them. Red was curled against his left side, her small head resting just below his shoulder, one hand gripping the fabric of his shirt. Blue was on his right, knees pulled up, completely still except for the slow rise and fall of her breathing. And Dot, tiny round-faced Dot with the little marking on her forehead, was lying directly on his chest, rising and falling with every breath he took, her ear pressed flat against him like she was listening to something very important happening inside. All three of them were sound asleep. Lisa stood in the doorway and didn't move for a long moment. On the small table next to the bunk there were 3 empty snack wrappers. The kind of cheap crackers and dried fruit mix that Jake bought in bulk because, as he had once explained to Carol very seriously, real food was expensive and crackers were forever. There was also an empty juice pouch with the straw still in it, lying on its side. And sitting propped against the wall, screen still glowing, was Jake's tablet. An old adventure movie frozen on the final scene? The kind of movie where everything blows up but everyone lives and there's a sunset at the end. Lisa pieced it together quietly. The girls had walked into an unlocked room. Jake had probably woken up for about 30 seconds, registered 3 small alien children standing in his doorway, and done what Jake Miller apparently did, decided it wasn't worth making a fuss. He had given them his snacks. Let them watch his movie. And at some point everyone had simply fallen asleep, because the room was warm and the movie was long and Jake's snoring was, against all reason, apparently the most comforting sound on the station. She almost didn't want to wake any of them. But she had a queen on one end of this station vibrating with terror and a chief advisor on the other end who was 40 minutes away from turning a diplomatic visit into an interstellar incident. So she stepped inside very quietly and crouched down next to the bunk. Up close, she could see the details she had missed from the doorway. Red's grip on Jake's shirt was tight, not scared, just secure. The way a kid holds onto something familiar in sleep. Blue had one of Jake's spare socks next to her face, which was strange, but also somehow completely on brand for a curious child exploring an alien space. And Dot, still rising and falling on Jake's chest, had a small expression on her face that Lisa had never seen on a Valkyrie before. Peaceful. Just completely, totally peaceful. And Jake slept through all of it. Every single bit of it. The alarm, the guards, the panic spreading through the entire station. He slept through a queen's fury and a potential diplomatic collapse and 3 alien children using him as a mattress. His face was completely relaxed. His breathing was slow and even. Lisa looked at him for a second and thought, not for the first time, that Jake Miller might be the least stressed person in the entire known universe. She reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. "Jake," she said quietly. He snored. "Jake." "Nothing." She shook him once, firmly. "Miller. Wake up." One eye opened. Then the other. He looked at the ceiling. Then slowly, very slowly, turned his head and looked at the 3 small beings asleep on and around him. Then he looked at Lisa. "Hey," he said. The next 5 minutes were, without question, the most unusual of Jake Miller's entire life. And that was saying something because 3 years ago he had accidentally locked himself inside a refrigeration unit for 6 hours and had to be found by the station dog. Lisa stepped back as the door opened fully behind her. 2 Valkyrie guards came in first, armor clicking, silver eyes sweeping the room in one sharp movement. Then Suvith, who had to duck slightly to get through the doorway and straightened up to his full height inside, which made the already small room feel like a closet. And then, quietly, with the kind of stillness that made everyone else in the room instinctively stand a little straighter, Queen Ethon. Jake sat up slowly. Or tried to. Red stirred but didn't wake. Dot made a small sound and pressed herself closer to his ribs. He looked down at them, then looked up at the Queen, then back down at the 3 small beings attached to him like barnacles. Then he looked at Lisa with an expression that said, very clearly, some help would be nice right now. Lisa gave him nothing. She had her professional face on. The one that gave away zero information. Queen Ethon looked at her daughters. For a long moment she didn't speak. Her eyes moved over each of them slowly, red, blue dot, checking, counting, making sure. Her hands, which had been pressed flat against her sides when Lisa last saw her, slowly released. Her fingers uncurled. Something in her posture shifted, just slightly, from rigid terror to something more complicated. Then she looked at Jake. Jake, to his credit, did not flinch. He met her eyes steadily, which was harder than it sounded because Queen Ethon had the kind of gaze that felt like it was reading every page of you at once. Suvith spoke first. "Explain yourself." Jake opened his mouth, closed it, thought about it for a second, then said in a perfectly calm voice, "I didn't want to wake them." The room was very quiet. "They were asleep," Jake continued, like this was a completely reasonable explanation to give to an alien queen surrounded by armed guards. "They seemed fine. Comfortable. I didn't think waking them up in the middle of the night made much sense." Suvith made a sound that was not quite a word. "So you just," Lisa said. "Went back to sleep," Jake said. "Yeah." Carol, standing just outside the doorway, made a noise that she quickly turned into a cough. It was at that moment that Red woke up. She opened her eyes, took in the room full of guards and her mother standing at the foot of the bunk, and did something nobody expected. She sat up straight, looked directly at Suvith and spoke. Fast, firm Velkari, the kind that carried weight even to ears that couldn't understand a word of it. Suvith went still. He looked at Red. Then at the Queen. Then back at Red. Blue was awake now too, adding her own voice. Even Dot, still barely conscious, made a small insistent sound from somewhere near Jake's left elbow. Lisa leaned toward the small translation unit clipped to her collar and turned the volume up. The translation came through patchy and slightly delayed, the way it always did with emotional speech. But the meaning came through clearly enough. They were saying he was safe. That the sound inside him was the right sound. That it felt like the deep place. Like the core. Lisa frowned. The core? Suvith was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. "On our world," he said carefully, "there is a sound. Deep underground. The pulse of the planet itself. It is the first sound our young hear. It is." He paused, searching for the right word. "It is the sound of being home." Lisa looked at Jake. Jake looked down at his own chest as if he had never really thought much about what was happening inside it. "His heartbeat," Lisa said slowly. Suvith said nothing. But he didn't disagree. The room sat with that for a moment. This big, quiet man from a small town in Ohio, who fixed broken things and bought crackers in bulk and never locked his door, had a heartbeat that sounded, to three young Velkari far from home, exactly like the ground beneath their feet. Exactly like safety. Exactly like the first sound they had ever known. Queen Ethon had not moved. Had not spoken. Her eyes were still on Jake, but the expression in them had changed completely. It wasn't fury anymore. It wasn't even surprise. It was something much quieter than both of those things. Something that, on a human face, Lisa would have called understanding. Nobody declared war. Which, given how the morning had started, was honestly the best possible outcome anyone could have hoped for. The guards stood down first. One by one, the clicking of armor settled into silence. Suvith stepped back from his full height and stopped vibrating with barely contained fury, which made the room feel about 3 times larger. Carol finally stopped pretending to cough outside the doorway and just stood there openly watching because at this point there was no professional reason to look away. Queen Ethon stayed where she was for a long moment. Her eyes moved from Jake to her daughters and back again, slow and steady. Then she did something that nobody in the room had seen her do once in the entire 3 days of the diplomatic visit. She sat down. Right there on the edge of the bunk, beside her daughters, and gathered Dot into her arms. Dot made a sleepy sound and curled into her without waking up fully. Red leaned against her mother's side. Blue watched the whole room with those sharp, quiet eyes of hers, like she was already filing everything away for later. For a moment it was just a mother and her kids. No titles. No diplomacy. No tension that could bend the fate of 2 civilizations. Just that. Lisa stood very still and let it be what it was. It was Suvith who eventually broke the silence. He turned to Jake, who had shifted to the far edge of his own bunk and was sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking like a man who very much wanted a coffee and understood that now was not the time to ask for one. "You will be given a title," Suvith said. Not warmly. But seriously. With weight behind it. Jake blinked. "I don't need a..." "It is not about need," Suvith said. "It is about what is true." The title was Velsu. Suvith explained it in the careful clipped English he used when precision mattered. There was no perfect translation. The closest human equivalent, he said, was something like living heartstone. A thing that holds warmth. A thing others return to. A fixed point. In Velkhari culture, it was one of the oldest honors they had, given only within families, only to those who had provided shelter and safety to the young in their most vulnerable moments. It had never, in recorded Velkhari history, been given to an outsider. Jake listened to all of this very carefully. Then he nodded once and said, "Okay." Carol later said that his complete lack of reaction was either the most dignified or the most oblivious response possible, and she genuinely could not decide which. Queen Ethon stood, her daughter still close to her, and looked at Jake one final time. She said something in Velkhari that Suvith did not translate. But she pressed one hand flat against her chest when she said it, which the translation briefings had noted as the closest thing the Velkhari had to a bow. Jake, not knowing what else to do, pressed his hand against his own chest and nodded. That was that. Lisa spent 4 hours writing the diplomatic report. She had written some strange ones over the years. There was the incident with the gravity settings, the misunderstanding about the food storage, the time someone accidentally played extremely loud music during a Velkhari silence ritual. But this one was different. She stared at the blank document for a while before she started typing. Then she just wrote exactly what happened, start to finish, as plainly as she could. She figured the truth was strange enough on its own without her trying to dress it up. She filed it. Then she sat back and stared at the ceiling for a while. Back on Earth, the story moved fast. Someone leaked it. Nobody ever found out who, though Carol became the primary suspect. And within 2 days it was everywhere. News sites. Discussion boards. People talking about it over dinner, in offices, on their commutes. A maintenance engineer from Ohio had accidentally become the first human in history to receive a Velkhari royal honor, entirely because he ran his heating too high, never locked his door, and couldn't bring himself to wake up 3 sleeping kids. People on Earth reacted the way they usually did to things they didn't fully understand but somehow felt good about. They scratched their heads. They shrugged. They laughed a little. And then they felt, in that quiet, unspoken way, oddly proud. Not because it was planned. Not because some diplomat had engineered it or some policy had made it happen. But because it was so completely, naturally human. Warm without thinking about it. Open without meaning to be. Safe just by existing. Jake, for his part, had one request when Lisa came to tell him the story had gone public. He looked up from the ventilation panel he was repairing, thought about it for a second, and said, "Do you think the Queen would replace my crackers?" Lisa looked at him for a long moment. "I'll ask Suvith," she said. He nodded and went back to work. And that was the end of it. Except it wasn't really. Because 3 weeks later a small package arrived at room 14B with no note inside. Just a box. Packed carefully. Full of snacks from a planet 40 light-years away that Jake had never heard of and couldn't pronounce the name of. He tried one. Thought about it. Ate the rest of the box by the end of the day. Some things, it turns out, don't need a translation.